Were there any questions you had, Joanne, before we got started?
No, I don't really know what to expect. I'm going into this a bit blind, so
Yeah, that's good. That's the best way to go into it. So is Jeremy. Jeremy has no clue either. Uh, um, all right. Uh, so yeah, let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Smooth Brain Society. After being interviewed myself, I'm back in the hosting chair again. Jeremy's here again as a co-host, and again, I'll just remind people the format of the podcast where me and a co-host who has no clue about the topic, Jeremy over here, it learn about research topic from our wrinkly brained expert, who is today Dr. Joanne Puddephatt. Um, Joanne is a senior lecturer in psychology at Edgehill University. She is a mixed methods researcher in the field of mental health. So what that means is essentially she has experience in using large data sets as well as conducting qualitative research to explore different mechanisms. She mainly works with mental health, alcohol use, and co-occurring problems. So welcome to the podcast, John.
thank you for having me.
All right. So let's just start with where we start with every guest, which is if you could give us a little bit of a background of what got you interested in your field and a little bit about your journey, so we can understand how you got to where you are at Edgehill University.
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose I don't know. It's a little bit of a kind of windy path. So, I've always been interested in understanding sort of mental health problems. Primarily, that was something that I was really interested in as an undergraduate student at Liverpool John Moores University, and then after doing the education, go down the educational route for a few years with, A levels, undergraduate, I took a break and travelled for a little while. And I thought I didn't want to be doing any kind of academic work or research or anything like that. And then during my travels and doing some jobs to get me by, I realised actually I quite want to do something that I'm really interested in that might make somewhat of a difference. So then I decided to come back home to the UK and do my master's in health psychology. And then because that was only 2 days a week, I wanted to get some clinical experience again. I thought I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. So I worked in a psychiatric intensive care unit in Manchester, which was probably one of the most pivotal experiences for me in determining where I am now. Sort of seeing the problems that people experience when they end up on a ward like that, where they are, detained under the Mental Health Act, and just seeing their circumstances. I loved working with the patients. I got quite frustrated about what I could do as part of my job at the time. And I also realised I didn't want to be a clinical psychologist. So I had to go back to the drawing board, and I actually liked the sort of research side of it. And I was became really interested in how, sort of people's social environments and how that can, contribute towards the problems that they end up experiencing, particularly around their mental health. And also how that enables them or doesn't enable them to cope with their situation. And so we would often see people on the ward who had substance use problems and really struggled to access support, particularly if I found it's not empirical research, but an observation I made was that, a lot of the people coming onto the ward were really from quite disadvantaged backgrounds, didn't have much family or friend support, and they seem to be coming back through the system quite a lot. Whereas you would sometimes get someone from a more affluent background, had a lot of support, and it might be that the medication has stopped working or whatever, and then they'd go away and you wouldn't necessarily see them again. So it was just a bit of an observation that I'd made. And then there was an opportunity to do some research at the University of Liverpool as a research assistant. and that was actually focusing on alcohol, an alcohol intervention for veterans. And then it kind of snowballed from there, and I was then able to get a PhD, which I wrote with sort of my supervisor at the time, which was then focusing on co-occurring alcohol and mental health problems. But I suppose what I do now for research, it's always really important for me to think back to those different experiences that I've sort of been exposed to, and thinking about, what is the point in what I'm doing? Like, what difference is it actually going to make? So I've always got that at the forefront of my mind when it comes to any research that I'm doing or I'm involved in, is thinking about those people that I have seen, and how I can sort of work more closely with them within the research environment to make sure that what we're doing has potential to help people. It's not always possible. There's only so much researchers can do sometimes, but I like to think that that always guides what I do. So yeah, so that's kind of my long and windy road into research and where I'm at the moment at Edge Hill.
No, nice. No, that's really nice that you then have a little bit of clinical experience as well to go on, because I guess in my intro I just said mixed methods, and when I said mixed methods, they're talking about the statistics side and a little bit of, when you say qualitative research, people usually just think interviews, maybe a little bit more than that. But yeah, if you could elaborate on, well, so first of all, now when you say mixed methods, you're actually like completely mixed methods. You have experience with clinical stuff as well. Um, how has that sort of influenced the way you approached your qualitative work? And I guess a question half a step back is, when you talk about qualitative work, what are you talking about in your field when you do it?
Um, I suppose so. In terms of what I see as qualitative work, is more from like a research or an academic perspective. So interviewing people who have co-occurring problems, who are from different backgrounds. Whatever the focus of the research is on, it's sort of interviewing or doing focus groups with those groups of people. But I've also learned a lot from interviewing staff who work in services, and sort of learning about the different perspectives from those different groups of people. And what I found is that you can find some very similar issues, but then some very different um, assumptions or perspectives from those different sides. So I actually quite like interviewing different people who are potentially exposed to the same thing but coming at it from a different angle. I think it's always interesting to get those different perspectives. So that's what I would class as sort of, for me, as a researcher, is the qualitative research. I suppose a separate thing that I do a lot of is sort of patient and public involvement work. I suppose I don't really consider it as much as qualitative research, because I don't see working with the patients or the people who have lived experience with, say, for example, co-occurring problems. I don't see them as participants in the work. I see them as contributing equally, if not more, in some ways, because they've gone down the path that I'm interested in, and learning from their experiences and understanding what is needed from me or members of a project team to sort of address or better understand the issues that they're going through. So I suppose I see that different to qualitative research, because I suppose I'm not trying to I'm trying to understand both of those different groups of people, for example, but in a different way. And that's where I sort of come at it. I can't remember your first question though. I'm really sorry.
No, you answered it. You
Okay.
answered it pretty well, so don't worry. Sorry, I was just waiting if Jeremy wanted to say anything. uh,
Just listening and learning, honestly. It's fascinating. I really, really like how you've mentioned that you kind of work with these people as opposed to treating them as subjects, which I think is a really interesting point.
Yeah, I think I really value it. It's something that I really try and do my best to incorporate in the research. I mean, I feel like, you always learn something new, and learn how you could do better for future work. I don't feel like I ever get it 100% right with research or with patient and public involvement work. I feel there's always some ways that you can improve, and that sometimes unexpected things come up that you've never come across before. And so at the time, you're just dealing with things as they come and dealing with it as best as you can. And then trying to learn from that going forwards when it comes to the next project. But I do try and have, the people at the heart of the research. It's tricky, it can be really hard to balance. And, the timescales with research is very different to what other people might be expecting, particularly if they've not been involved in research or patient public involvement before. It can be quite a bit slower than people would like it to be. But I've learned to try and help address that through like managing expectations, just being very clear with them, what they can expect and when they can expect for things to be done. But yeah, it's something I'm really quite passionate about, the patient and public involvement side. For me, it is research, but the power dynamics are a bit different than, interviewing someone or getting them to fill in some questionnaires. I think that they have a lot of value. And like I say, it was really from actually the clinical experience that really got me thinking about, I wouldn't have known some of the things that came up during my time there had I not gone and worked in those environments. Like, the traditional routes, I think it's very hard to capture that until you're actually in that environment and see, how sort of individual level, but also system level processes, just how things work in a system, particularly in healthcare, and what sort of impact that has. And for me, as like working as in that hospital, I was also tied with what I could give them or what I could do to support them, because I wasn't allowed to do certain things, so I wasn't qualified to do certain things. So you learn. I learned a lot from that type of experience, and from just being with patients, for long hours, 13-hour shifts. You get to know them very, very well when they're on the ward, and you get to know lots of different pieces about their life. And it's really through that I don't think it's very difficult to get that from other ways of like doing research. And that's why I like the patient and public involvement stuff, because I feel like you can kind of tap into that, not as much of like a sort of closer level, because you're not with them 13 hours a day, for example, but you certainly get to have a bit more of an insight, and it's a bit more flexible than if you've got like an interview schedule where you've got set questions that you want to ask them, that you're asking of everyone. And, there's only so much you can do with that.
Does that present any further challenges? I know you mentioned working with them, sort of the challenge there is managing their expectations on timelines and ways you can help. Because I imagine you would get emotionally attached to some of these people and some of the things that they're going through. Does that ever, I don't know if the phrase muddy the water is the right one to use, but does that ever present challenges for you personally and for the research?
Not so much. I mean, it's about just sort of maintaining the boundaries and also acknowledging that there's only so much I can do for them. I mean, you do you get to know them quite well. I mean, with sort of patient and public involvement work, it kind of depends how involved they are and how many times you're meeting with them. A lot of that really depends on funding, for example, so being able to reimburse them for their time to actually come to meetings and stuff. I suppose, if anything, it makes me more aware of the different things that they've got going on, and then thinking, okay, they've raised these issues. What is there anything in the evidence in like the academic research field that can point us to trying to bring together that their actual lived experience along with what we know in the literature or what we don't know. And I think for me, it's just about maintaining those boundaries. So it's never really muddied the waters as such in terms of, things that they might tell me or things like that. I think it's more, there's maybe just a bit more pressure to try and keep the ball going with it because, with research, the majority of it's contingent on getting the funding. And I can't promise that'll lead to funding because I don't know. If it could, it'd be great, but we don't know that. And so I try and sort of manage that by making it clear to them and also be a bit more gentle to myself, I guess, that, these are the things that I can control and, I can apply for certain things or try and collaborate with people to do certain things to keep that momentum going with, the lived experience member, for example, but also just being really clear with them that, thank you for being involved and, we're doing what we can to keep this work going. But obviously the nature of the game is that you need the funding to allow that to happen. And so that for me is the trickier bit because they're dedicating their time that they don't need to, and sharing some very personal experiences at times. And, it just feels, for me, I just feel more responsible to make sure that I'm handling that in the right way and that it hopefully leads to something more meaningful, but within my own control. There's only so much you can do. A lot of it's out of our control as researchers, unfortunately.
Yeah. We can. One thing which you mentioned when you spoke about your clinical work was you saw a bit of anecdotal evidence, as you said, or observational evidence, which you said of meeting certain people, more people from certain backgrounds, a bit more. Because you do, and you say you look back at what you do now, qualitative PPI work with what you find in, what do you say, in academia or like in the literature. Have you found stuff which has substantiated your sort of observational, or what you saw observationally?
Kind of. It's something that I'd like to try and do a bit more of, to be honest. So, as part of one aspect of my PhD was looking at the role of social support and neighbourhood disadvantage on among people who have a mental health problem, and looking at whether that moderated the associations with their levels of drinking, so whether they were a non-drinker or drank at levels that were harmful to their health. In terms of, and so what we found, so that was using an existing data set of the national survey of people living in England, and what we saw was that people from living in sort of like the more deprived areas, that kind of so people who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who have a mental health problem, and who also lived in sort of more deprived areas, they were more likely to drink at levels harmful to their health. The social support one was a little bit trickier to sort of understand. And so I think that needs a bit more of unpicking. There is quite a bit of literature around social support, sort of like the qualitative side, but that's something that I would like to look more into because, as I say, there's different levels of support, there's different types of support. So someone could have lots of family and friends, for example, but actually, the nature of those relationships might not be the most positive. Someone might want support, might see support in terms of financial support as one way of getting support. Another might be emotional support. So there's like different types of support, which there are questionnaires and measures out there that look at that, but it's a bit it seems a little bit messy. So I think something that I'd like to do is sort of try to untangle that a little bit, because I think it would be interesting to see, particularly for people with co-occurring problems or people who have co-occurring problems but also come from different levels of advantage or disadvantage, what that type of support looks like and how that sort of impacts them. But I think there needs to be a bit more in that line of work, really. I'm not sure that there are some measures out there, but I'd need to look into them more, really, before I could say much more on that.
No, that's really nice. What I was thinking while you were saying that was about some of the current work which you're doing, because and you mentioned co-occurring problems over there in that sentence. Could you explain what you mean by co-occurring problems?
Yeah, so co-occurring problems, I think, for what I do is really people who have both a mental health condition and an alcohol problem at the same time. The way in which they co-occur could differ. So someone might have a mental health problem first, and then they potentially have limited resources to sort of cope with that condition that they're dealing with. And so they might use alcohol as a way of managing their mental health condition. And what happens is that might become a bit of a cycle, a maladaptive cycle, where they start drinking at levels that aren't good for their mental, physical health. And they might also become quite socially isolated through that. There is also the other way where, someone might have a problem with drinking, and then because of their problems with alcohol, they might have experienced, sort of negative consequences from their drinking, and that might then worsen their mental health, and then it becomes a cycle. So, or it could be that they both occur at the same time. We know that there are sort of potential genetic factors that might be common for both alcohol and mental health conditions, which mean that someone's more susceptible to that. I mean, when you look at the evidence, there's more. So when researchers followed people up for a longer period of time and tried to test, which comes first, is it alcohol problems or mental health conditions that come first? They've generally found more support for the view that that the mental health condition comes first, and then alcohol was used potentially as a way of coping, and that creates that cycle. So that's what I mean by co-occurring problems, is you've got two conditions, but it can be a bit messy as to which comes first. That's still quite a bit of a debate in literature.
Do you think that which comes first plays a role in how you sort of deal with it or treat it in that sort of way?
Yes. It's a bit tricky though, because if you have both an alcohol and a mental health condition, what we know is that it can be very tricky for them to get support for either of those problems, whichever came first. So, for example, if someone first had a mental health condition, and then the alcohol problems came later, they can struggle to get access to support for their mental health condition because they do drink alcohol. So some services won't see them until they've stopped drinking. And that's really tricky because if that is one of the only things that's helping them at that time, then you're taking away that one thing that is helping them before they've been able to even access that mental health support to address that first issue. And, it might be that even before that condition came about, they might have had sort of quite traumatic experiences. There might have been a lot of different factors that have contributed and potentially that have led to them developing a mental health condition. So although I do think we should be thinking about which has come first, I think it's also about making sure that they have access to support for both of those conditions at the same time, even if it's delivered by different services, because otherwise you run the risk of, physical harm if they're drinking at really heavy levels and they stop drinking all of a sudden just to get access to a service. Then that's really risky for their physical health. But also, there's then nothing, we know that there's quite big delays in people accessing both alcohol and mental health services, let alone if they need, say, more trauma-informed support, for example. We know that there's big delays in that. And so it's very difficult to tackle those, like one problem at a time, if one is helping the other, even if it's not helping that person, but for that person at that time, it's what's working-ish for them, even if it's potentially causing more harm. Hopefully that makes sense.
You sort of touch on the fact that it feeds into different places in this cycle, right? It's kind of like a chicken and egg situation. And I'm wondering if your perception or your relationship to alcohol has changed since sort of as you've sort of undergone this research.
That's a really good question. It has, actually, to be honest. It's made me think a lot more about how I drink alcohol, and what it's done for me. I mean, it's hard as well because I've got older, so I can't handle a drink like I used to. But yeah, it has made me think a lot more, and I think it's also made me look at the people around me's drinking, like relationship with alcohol. So, for example, my granddad, he's always had like a bottle of whiskey next to his chair in the living room, right? And that was just, and what was the other one? Can't think what it is. It's gone from me. But basically, he'd always have a bottle of alcohol next to him. Not that he'd be drinking it all the time, but it was always there. And then we'd get to a certain time in the day, and he'd have it. He'd have a glass of it, and like he was just known for like falling asleep with a glass of whiskey on his belly, resting on his belly, and that would never ever tip. Like he'd be asleep and it would never tip. And I never thought anything of it. Truly, never thought anything of it because that was just something that I grew up with until I started working in this area, and then I was like, that's not great, like, and I would know I wouldn't broach that with him personally, but it's through the research where I've started looking at my own and other people's drinking where I'm like, oh, okay, like some of this is a bit interesting to look at, and I'd never, I wouldn't personally go out and say anything to them because I don't think I'm qualified or that's my place to say it. But it certainly made me look at my relationship with alcohol when I use alcohol, how alcohol actually makes me feel when I do drink, but also that of the people around me, because I'd never thought that that was a bit weird and potentially problematic that my granddad would do that. And then it was only when I started working in it, I was like, having like, half a bottle of whiskey, most nights is not, we would term that as like something that's not good for your health and, potentially a problem. And it's only through doing the research where I started to question that, I suppose. But yeah. Oh, Aussie White, that was the drink. Aussie White, it was a bottle of Aussie White. Just came to my mind then. I've got to give a shout out to Aussie White. That's his drink. And he swears that it makes him feel better. Or he swears that it's given him good health because he never has a hangover the next day.
Take notes, Jeremy. For hangover purposes.
Yeah, I know, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how much I believe in with that, but I'm not going to question a 90-year-old man, to be honest, at this point.
No, my granddad passed away at 93, 94, and his rule was never drink alone, and that's it. And I was like, don't question the man.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, you've got like, there's certain people, and you see it in like the research that I do, where they would never question certain people, particularly the elders, I guess, with what they say. And then, you start, I don't know, working in that line or whatever. And then you're like, actually, I'm not quite sure that what you're saying is right, but I'm also probably not going to try and even address that with you at this point in your life.
One thing which you brought up with that story is a story of my own, or observations which I've seen myself of friends, family members who started drinking more when they felt more isolated. So when they were unemployed, for example. Another time was when one of my cousins was working in a small town and had no friends, and it was a real tiny town, so started drinking a lot more then. And then now when they're back in a big city with which they grew up in, or like which they grew up in, don't nearly drink as much. So is that one? It touches back to some of your previous answers on isolation, and also to how behaviors sort of change and how you realize it when you start researching or working in the field.
Yeah, definitely. And I see that with like lots of people that I've interviewed in the past. Like that's why I like the qualitative work. So, I definitely value like lots of the quantitative work and what you can get from big secondary data sets. But when you're talking to people, or even, maybe not as part of research, but just through those observations, you start to notice, certain things, and, how sort of when the patterns change, because it's common for any behavior to sort of change over time. It kind of reflects lots of different things going on in your life that might not be, poor mental health. It might not be that you're necessarily going through a tough time. It might be that you're just getting older and you can't hack it like you used to, and or you've got like certain responsibilities that you can't engage in certain behaviors. But I think it's very interesting to think about the wider context within which drinking happens, but also particularly with people with co-occurring alcohol mental health problems. I think it's always important to look at the wider setting that they sit within, because I think ultimately that really can contribute towards what they're going through. And we know that there's a lot of research to show that, and a lot of like the patient public involvement work has highlighted, how important things like housing, social isolation, employment, finances, how important they all kind of have played and still do play in sort of staying well or, potentially declining. So yeah, I think for me, it's always important to think about that wider context. I think if you look at things too much in isolation, I think it's very difficult to get a real understanding of what's going on without looking at that.
This is very funny because literally the last podcast was about isolating particular things and doing animal research, and then we expanded back out and we're like, but it's very important to not isolate things.
I suppose it depends what you're looking at, right?
Exactly,
and there are
exactly,
some, you in some ways you do have to look at things in isolation, particularly in certain lines of research. I think to really understand, it depends on what your question is, right? Depends on what it is that you're looking at and what you're interested in. I just find that there's a lot of contributing factors from all the work that I've done or read. There's so many contributing factors. It's very hard to even say which one is contributing the most, for example, without potentially looking at genetics and even then you've still then got to you've got to look at all of the other factors and trying to think of what the other factors could be. But yeah, I just based on a lot of the work that I've done, it's kind of, you have to understand the wider circumstance to get a bit more to grips with particularly with people with co-occurring alcohol mental health problems.
yeah. So I want to use the next part of the podcast to talk about next step. So if suppose we're talking about your work is about understanding the contexts and people's circumstances and co-occurring problems and so on, but the thing which you had mentioned at the very start is wanting to make a change in people's lives. So what sort of outcomes are you trying to achieve currently with your work, or what do these sort of outcomes look like? How would a PPI process sort of lead to change, I guess is my question.
So I think for me, I think there still needs to be a lot more work around understanding co-occurring problems with specific groups of people who we know are more likely to experience disadvantage. So a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years has been really focused on people from, diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds. So we know that they have poorer health outcomes. We know that they are less likely to engage with sort of, formal mental health or alcohol services. And firstly, just trying to understand more about what they need to access that support or to even seek that type of support. And then, which I think we're doing quite a bit of work on that, and both the patient and public involvement work, where we've been working very closely with people who have a mental health condition and come from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. That's been really useful to think about what systems are in place, where do they get referred to, where are they accessing support, and what are the issues that they've had so far, has really helped to understand what is needed going forwards. And so I suppose for me, the next steps are to work out how do we try to implement those changes. And it's quite a complex one, because on the one hand, it's sort of trying to do it in a way which is addressing the needs of the people that we're interested in. So people with co-occurring alcohol mental health problems, making sure that they're accessing or know where to access support and can access it in different ways. Some people might not want to go to certain services. They might prefer to go to a community or mutual aid service. And so that's on the one side for that individual, but then it's also for staff and services that are available in different areas to know what their service users are looking for, and to also know what the different places of support that they could signpost people to. So trying to sort of make the change from both ends, not just for helping the individual, but also helping staff and services who are already very busy, very much under-resourced, and doing it in a way where we're not trying to get them to do loads more work. So that's like a very tricky balance. And so I suppose for future work that I'm trying to do is to work more closely with both of those groups to see how we can either not necessarily develop systems, because I'm not sure that I could do that as just a lone researcher, but working out how can we work with what we've got to make sure that or adapt things in a way that becomes more inclusive for people from different ethnic religious backgrounds, from different levels of disadvantage, who might not live in an area where they can easily walk to or go and attend a mental health service, for example. So that's sort of where I'm sort of at the moment. I think there's still lots of work that needs to be done. I think in terms of I think that the needs depend on particular groups of people, people from different areas, with different characteristics. I mean, a lot of the sort of work that I've been doing around ethnicity and religion has really just sort of highlighted how the very different groups within that. And I'm not sure that the current guidance and research necessarily acknowledges that to its full extent. There's sometimes, sort of not necessarily generalizations, but there's certainly, like in the big data sets, people from certain ethnicities will tend to be grouped as one ethnicity, for example. You might have an Asian population within a big sample size, but that is a very big, broad group that doesn't really speak to all of the sort of nuances within that. And if you're using that data to inform anything, it's a bit risky, because you don't know what's underneath that. And it's really through the qualitative work and like the patient public involvement work where you've really start to understand a bit more about the intricacies within that and how that actually impacts where people want to get support, whether they'll access support, whether they'll actually engage with it and stay engaged with it. I feel like I've gone on a bit of a tangent there, but I think there's a lot more that still needs to be done to really get to grips with what both the individual needs, but also what staff and services need, and maybe assume the individual needs and sort of marrying them together to work out how they can better access that support when they need it, and regardless of if they've got both an alcohol and a mental health problem, that shouldn't necessarily always stand in the way.
A lot of the stuff has, obviously, it sounds very heavy. Like it is, it's a very heavy topic, I think, and you're clearly immersed in this world quite a lot. So I guess one of the last burning questions from me would be twofold. Is sort of again a look at you personally, but also sort of wider advice to the audience, which is sort of how do you manage your mental health while dealing with all of this stuff? What are sort of the good practices that you put into place to ensure that your mental health is well, I guess?
I don't think I count the second question, but in terms of managing my mental health, I do little things. So I don't have my work emails on my phone. So I do not see my emails unless I'm on my laptop or a computer. I put that in place fairly quickly after coming into academia, when I was on a part-time contract. So I was working 3 days a week as a research assistant. And what I was finding was that on my days off, I was still checking emails. And then it felt like I had never had a break by the time I'd come back to doing the work again. So I, ever since then, and continue as a lecturer, which is somewhat of a controversial thing, but I stand by it, is I won't have my emails on my phone. There is never usually anything too important that needs to be addressed at midnight or on a weekend. I break that promise by checking emails if, say, I've got like a big deadline that I know like needs to get sorted. That is the only time that I'll do it. And I'll do what I might do work of an evening, but it's kind of on my terms. It's not with emails. I find them just really distracting from actually doing any kind of work. You know, you can spend I find I spend about a good hour of the morning addressing emails. So if I was to do that all the time, I'd just get burnt out. What else do I do? I just surround myself with different people, and I'm one of, in my family and friends, sort of close family and friends, I'm like the only person that works in academia and research, so which I actually quite like. I mean, it was a bit lonely as a PhD student when you know, your family and friends don't quite understand just how, you know, what a PhD really involves. Or, you know, for me, like sorting out a piece of syntax was like gold. I was just made up for like the entire week, and you've got like your partner or like your mum going, okay, great. You know, like the underappreciation of sort of getting that syntax code going on N+ or something like that. But yeah, I quite like that I don't, you know, I obviously have friends and, you know, good friends in the sector and stuff, but I quite like that when I go home, it's completely separate to what I do at work. It gives me, it's just making sure that I have time for those breaks. Otherwise, you just get burnt out. I mean, there are times I definitely struggle when you've got loads of deadlines. And I particularly found going from being only a researcher, to a lecturer managing the teaching, you know, a bit of a challenge initially. But actually, I quite like that, you know, some days I just do teaching, and that's really quite nice because I'm just with students, and that's that. And then I also just dedicate days to research, where it's really nice to just dip back into what I actually really like. I didn't catch the second part of your question, sorry.
It was just me rephrasing the question a little bit. Just, yeah, no, you answered it perfectly, and yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
I was gonna say lucky you for that, because my mom did a PhD, and not only did she do it, she did it in my field.
In your field as well?
Well, she did more genetics. I did it more psychology. Okay. So she would rip apart everything I wrote.
I was going to say, what is that like? I mean, I suppose I would assume there's some good things about it, but
there's good things about it, like the opposite of what you said. There's someone to converse with.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I've got my supervisors to converse with. I don't need to come home to that.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, like, there are definitely some times where you get a bit frustrated and you're like, you don't appreciate what I have managed to do today, or, you know, you don't appreciate how big this deadline is. But I think it also, you know, but then it's good to have someone that has some of that understanding. But I also think I just find it all very grounding. You know, you have like a day where, I don't know, you've like your paper got rejected, and now you've got to find somewhere else for it to go, and then you go home and then you talk about something entirely different that's actually really, you know, personally quite important, and it just, you know, it just humbles you a little. It just brings you back, brings everything back into perspective, I think.
I think my mom was pretty good with that. The first time I said, "Oh, I had a paper rejected," she was like, "Oh, I've had hundreds. Don't worry, it's fine.
Oh, it's lovely to hear.
Get used to it. It's all good." But what was it? There was one more thing which I wanted to say about that, which is equally funny. Yeah. The other problem is because my mom wrote her thesis on a typewriter. She typed it out.
Wow.
So she's like, we have it way too easy with Google scholaring, PubMeding information, when she had to go to the library, order this Society of Human Genetics journal from America, and it would come, and then they would read that paper, and it was a whole process.
Oh god.
And then if there was a typo in the thesis, you needed to go to a typewriter and type the whole page out again. And now again, just backspace delete the computer. So you don't get much appreciation either when you're like, I have a hard day.
I mean, I can understand that. To be fair, yeah, I can understand that. I think there's also like different pressures nowadays, but I'm not envious of your mum doing that. I mean, even like now when I like, what was it? I had to open my thesis the other day just to grab like a reference for something, or I can't remember why. There was a reason for it, and I saw like a typo, and I was just like, and I've got it bound, you know, and you're just looking at it like, I need to quickly close this before I get really annoyed, let alone do a typewriter. Gosh.
Awesome. So in interest of time, we'll start our wrapping up. Joanne, did you have what can like sort of people expect if they wanted to sort of get involved with your work? Sorry, so what are the current sort of projects you're doing? If anybody would be interested in getting involved or getting in touch with you, how would they be able to do that? Yeah, if you talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, so currently we're working on developing some tools for mental health care professionals around sort of trying to enable and encourage having conversations around drinking, but with a particular focus on culturally sensitive conversations around drinking. So if you work in the mental health field, or even sort of the community health field, or you are someone from a diverse ethnic, religious, cultural background, then you can find me on X. I normally say Twitter, but it's X now, isn't it? Otherwise, you can also email me. You can find my email on the Edge Hill University website. That's sort of the main work that I'm doing at the moment, but we also do quite a bit of work around sort of the different ways in which people with co-occurring alcohol mental health problems access support. And then we've also got I'm on a project with a colleague at Edge Hill University looking at sort of recovery from alcohol problems and mutual age groups. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, then just get in touch with me either by email or Twitter. It's usually the way that people find me.
And Joanne will only reply during work hours, so...
And I will only reply during work hours. I might see it, but I won't reply straight if it's outside of work hours.
Awesome. Jeremy, any final thoughts?
Other than this has been absolutely fascinating. No.
Oh, thanks.
Awesome. All right, Joanne, the final question we ask all our guests is, if you had one piece of advice for people listening, what would it be?
Like general piece of advice?
General piece of advice.
Oh my goodness, gosh.
It's the toughest question, actually.
That's probably the toughest question of this podcast. It would be, you can only control what you control. So if you can't control it, then try not to worry too much about it. There's only so much you can do.
Awesome.
Amazing advice.
I try and stick with that. It doesn't always work, but try and go with that mantra.
Yeah. It's the thought that counts.
Yeah. Yeah. Try it. See if it works.
Follow-up advice. It's the thought that counts.
Awesome. No, thank you very much, Jan. This was really fun. Thanks, Jeremy, again for coming on.
No worries. Thank you, guys.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. Just a reminder to follow our socials and all that, because I never say it, but looking
Patreon.
At Jeremy, who's a creative director and a social media person himself. So please like, subscribe, follow. Go visit smoothbrainsociety.com.
Patreon, Instagram, all of the things. Go and follow go and support, because this is important stuff that the world needs to hear.
Awesome. And yeah, thank you everyone, and goodbye.